Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Family Matters interview series. Today, we are being joined by Jennifer Milsovic, occupational therapist. Hello, Jen. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me on this episode.
Thanks for taking the time to join us today. We're excited to hear more about this topic of planning for a holiday visit with a loved one with cognitive impairment. We know a lot of family members out there are going to be facing this very thing in the coming weeks and months. So, what a great time to learn more about this. Before we jump into our topic, can you tell our audience a little bit more about yourself and your background as an occupational therapist?
Sure. So my background, I've been an occupational therapist since 2002. And since then, I've really worked in a variety of settings. So hospitals, rehab, nursing facilities, home therapy, outpatient, kind of the whole gamut. But really, a major focus of my career has been on working with adults with cognitive impairment. Um, and just for any listeners that may not be familiar with occupational therapy, we work with people to maximize function with daily tasks, and that includes addressing any, cognitive limitations that might preclude participation in day-to-day activities. And holiday activities are super important to many people, but for sure can be difficult for those with cognitive limitations. So I'm really happy to be here today talking with you about this topic.
Great. Yeah, I think this is going to be really helpful for our family members out there. So, as we're kind of running up here to the holiday season, I know a lot of families really want to include their older adult loved one into family, celebrations and gatherings. This can be a little bit challenging for persons with cognitive impairment. Can you tell us a little bit about what are some of the barriers or difficulties that our family members should anticipate to help them plan ahead?
Sure. So oftentimes holiday gatherings involve multiple people. So let's just say, for example, that you're hosting Thanksgiving dinner. So maybe you have your two children and your spouse. Then maybe you have, eight other extended family members coming. So that's 12. So imagine now that math in my head. Imagine now all those 12 people kind of in the same space. So maybe in the living room, in the kitchen. So it's going to be loud. People might be talking about different things, having different conversations, and then maybe you have holiday music playing in the background. If you don't have an impairment in your cognition, you might perceive that situation as fun and dynamic and festive. But if you have an impairment in your cognition, that situation could feel really just chaotic and stressful. Um, so often it's hard for people with cognitive impairment to filter out things going on in the background, like other conversations or the background music, in order for them to attend to the conversation that they're directly involved in. And then, if you add on top of that, just plain difficulty following a conversation because of problems with working memory, and then on top of that, maybe a difficulty with hearing, you've created a really stressful situation for an older adult with cognitive impairment. And maybe this stress causes the older adult to just sort of shut down and sit quietly in the corner. Or maybe it causes them to have some agitation, which obviously could be problematic in a group setting.
For sure.
Right. But either way, now you have a really challenging situation, not only for the older adult, but also for the family members hosting the event. And I'm really just saying this to set the stage, so that people can keep in mind if you invite mom, who has dementia to Thanksgiving and mom becomes agitated, it's probably not just mom being difficult. It's more likely that her cognitive impairment is making it hard for her to participate in the holiday like she used to. And I think that this can be a hard pill to swallow. Most of us have really specific holiday traditions, and we go into holidays with, maybe very specific expectations of how things are going to go. If mom was the one that took care of most of the cooking for the holiday, and now mom is in the early stages of dementia and is overwhelmed and isn't even eating the food, that can just be a really emotionally tough thing to handle.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you bring up some really good points. For the loved one of the person with dementia, you want the holidays to be as stress-free and enjoyable as possible,
Right.
but that very environment may be setting that person up to be more uncomfortable, more challenged, having a difficult time just managing the environment, let alone, the enjoyable piece of the holidays and seeing all the folks that they love. So I think you brought up a really great point. Maybe we can talk more about the idea of holiday gatherings, which do involve larger crowds, more people. You can't always control how many folks are coming to your dinner or your event. Are there any strategies that you can share with our audience that might make things less challenging if you do have these sort of larger events? How can you kind of navigate that? What can you do to plan ahead?
Right, that's a great point. I mean, you also can't control the size of your family, and some people just have larger families.
Right, right.
Yeah. So the first thing that I would say is, at the end of the day, if a large gathering is just too overwhelming for your loved one, pivoting to a one-on-one or small group visit instead may really be what's best and just least stressful for everyone. But we can come back to that. Let me answer your question first. So some strategies. If your loved one with cognitive impairment is joining a larger family or friends gathering, I think that really planning ahead is the most helpful thing to make things less stressful for everyone. And the key here really is thinking about in advance what you can do to minimize the chaos and the stimulation. Maybe, for example, instead of having everyone, in the living room all at once, you're going to encourage people to spread out a bit. So maybe you have appetizers or snacks kind of in multiple rooms. And that way, instead of being in a room with 12 people, dad is maybe just in a room with 4 people. So it's not as overwhelming. And then maybe also you decide that you're not going to have music on in the background. So there's one less thing for your loved one's
That's an
brain to
easy
have to.
fix.
For sure, for sure. It'll just be one less thing for your loved one to have to, their brain to have to filter out to focus on the conversation. Um, and then another thing I would say is, just kind of realizing in advance that you may need to adjust your expectations for that person's participation. Um, Most people don't like to see someone just sitting there and not involved in the conversation. But really, that may just be less overwhelming for mom just to be there, to be around loved ones, but not necessarily pulled into every single conversation. And speaking of expectations for conversation, if dad is telling the same story over and over, that's okay. Just let it go. Certainly don't say, you've already told us that. In that situation, the person's memory deficits are causing them to repeat themselves. And likely that story that they're telling and retelling is very rote to them. So it's a very comfortable way for them to participate in the conversation. Similarly, if mom calls Debbie Edna, same thing, just move on, without
Right.
correcting her. So really just meet the person where they are so that they can enjoy themselves on that holiday, and don't feel anxious and stressed because you've called out their impairments in front of everyone.
That's a great
Um,
tip because that can be uncomfortable and people don't
for
always,
sure,
know how to react in that moment.
especially if you have cognitive impairments, right?
Oh, for sure.
Um, And then speaking of conversations, at a gathering, just same things that you would do even on a non-holiday, making sure that when you engage with your loved one in a busier than usual environment, that you're sitting close to them and facing them so they can read your face and your body language, as cues during the conversation. And I know this is a really long answer to your question, but
No,
one
I love
last
all these
thing.
ideas.
Okay, great. One last thing on this topic is I also want to mention that if your loved one has some physical limitations on top of cognitive limitations, so, maybe difficulty with mobility, a little preparation really does go a long way here too. So, if somebody has both physical and cognitive limitations, a really busy environment is going to increase their risk for falls, really just because it's hard for that person to attend to, walking or moving around safely, but also what's going on all around them at the same time. So for example, if they use a walker, maybe you pick up the throw rugs and you minimize, decorations on the floor. Or maybe you have them arrive a little early to help them and get into the house and get settled so that they aren't trying to, play Frogger or navigate around a, large crowd of people.
Or like, people who bring little children who might be underfoot, could be a tripping hazard. Yeah.
Great point. Or animals like dogs, cats, absolutely.
Right. No, these are really good ideas. I think just planning ahead and knowing, what the environment might look like and kind of giving the other attendees a small heads up, if this happens, just, let it roll. Don't engage with that, exactly what you said. If someone gets called by the wrong name or there's a repeat of a story, it's okay. Just go with it. I think
Let it
that'll
go
go, yeah, go a long way to keeping the peace and keeping the event, fun and on the right track.
for everyone.
Oh,
Absolutely.
absolutely. And I know that, holiday traditions are really important to people.
Mhm.
And as you mentioned earlier, your loved one might always been the one who hosted the holiday and now you're taking it over. You still want them to feel included and valued, but you want to keep the traditions going and the familiarity of what you do at the holidays with your family, but you also may have to modify some things to make it reasonable or realistic for that person to participate. Can you think of any strategies or ways that family members can honor those traditions but still help their loved one to participate in a way that's meaningful for them?
I love this question so much because maintaining traditions, just what you said, is so important. And especially for people with cognitive impairment, because those predictable things tend to stay in our brains, even when we have an impairment in memory. So, for example, if mom made pumpkin pie for every single Thanksgiving and Christmas, then the steps to make pumpkin pie might still be in her memory, even if she can't remember what she had for breakfast this morning. But what you can do is honor just what you said, honor these traditions by simplifying the tasks a bit. So, what I mean by that, for example, maybe the evening before every Thanksgiving, you would have mom and five other family members over to cook, and mom would make the pie. So maybe this year you just have mom over earlier in the day so that just the two of you can make the pie. So this would allow mom, to make that pie with less distraction, and then, you'd be available to supervise in the event of safety concerns, with say the oven. And really, you can apply this sort of task simplification to just about any tradition that's important to your loved one. Maybe dad always bought and wrapped the kids' Hanukkah gifts. So maybe this year you buy the gifts and take them over to dad's to wrap together. Or maybe you and mom always went shopping on Friday, the Black Friday after Thanksgiving. But the crowds and craziness of that would just be way too much for mom as her cognitive impairment, is advancing. So in that case, maybe you go to a less crowded shopping venue on a less crowded day. So you're really just thinking about how you can tailor the tradition to your loved one's cognitive level.
That makes a ton of sense. What you don't want to have happen is, have an emergency or an issue. It's much better to plan ahead and modify than it is to find yourself in the middle of chaos where someone's, as you mentioned earlier, maybe becoming aggressive or
Yes.
just overwhelmed or melting down out in public. That can be really problematic.
Exactly. And embarrassing for everybody, for the person with, impairment, for the
Oh,
family
for
members.
sure.
Exactly.
We talked a little bit about, having younger children as part of the bigger holiday picture. That adds a whole nother element, right, to the chaos and the confusion that might be going on. But, we do know that grandparents want to see their grandkids, and that can be really important for them. Are there any specific ideas or suggestions around maybe activities they could do together or how to incorporate, the younger family members in with the older adults to try to, again, create a more seamless experience and any, navigate any issues and plan ahead?
Yes, I think you hit the nail on the head. Kids, first of all, add another layer on top of this. But also, I think there's really no greater joy in many older adults' lives than being around kids, whether it's their own grandkids or, sometimes just any kids. But, as we know, kids can be loud, and on a holiday in particular, they're probably more excited and more wound up. Um,
Hmm.
And actually, just a quick anecdote related to this. This is a story that is so etched in my brain. When I was working in home health, so, I would go to people's homes to see them, and this was around Christmas time. The daughter of one of my patients told me about something that had happened over the past weekend. So their family had gotten together for a holiday gathering that included my patient who had dementia. And so her daughter said that her mom was just kind of sitting amongst the chaos, looking completely overwhelmed. So apparently, from across the room, her granddaughter starts shouting, "Grandma, watch my cartwheel."
Great.
And and apparently, grandma didn't respond. So her granddaughter just kept shouting over and over, apparently more and more loudly, for her to watch. So finally, when grandma didn't pay attention, the granddaughter just did the cartwheel anyway, but then she started to cry. And when her mom went over to her, the little girl said, "Grandma didn't care about my cartwheel." And I really won't
Oh,
forget that story because it was such an upsetting situation for my patient's family. I mean, upsetting enough that her, daughter took the time to tell me about it. But my point in telling the story is that if there are younger kids involved in a holiday gathering where you also have older adults with cognitive impairment, it might be a good idea to prepare them in advance. And even just saying simple things like grandma might tell the same stories more than once, or grandma might call you the wrong name, or sometimes grandma has trouble focusing around a lot of people, and that's okay. We'll be respectful of that. And I think just taking some time to talk about that beforehand can really save everybody some stress.
oh, for sure.
Yeah. And really that, I mean, that applies to any situation, not just a holiday, but I think especially during the holidays when, the excitement is high. Um, and we talked about how easily, overstimulating a holiday gathering, can be for someone with cognitive impairment. So, as we said earlier, just being mindful of the extra background noise, and like literal background noise that kids can bring, to the situation. And maybe, just having a space for mom or whoever to retreat to if things are getting chaotic and, wild.
Yes, that makes 100% sense to me. And you feel for the grandchild in that story because they're just doing what they do, what probably always worked in the past, not
Right.
realizing that was not going to work this time.
Yeah, it was
So,
sad.
yeah. And when I think about how that would play out in a family dynamic, you can imagine how that could be really hurtful for somebody. So that brings up a really good point. For persons who have more advanced cognitive impairment, who might have a diagnosis of dementia, who maybe really are significantly different this year than they were last year, what are some strategies for that sort of patient population, for those older adults, that they can really kind of plan ahead and maximize their communication with that loved one, but also come up with some activities that might be more appropriate for them this year than maybe in years past they played a game, or they watched a movie together, and this year maybe they're just not able to do that now. What can they do specifically with someone who may have more advanced dementia or more significant cognitive impairment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And really, just to kind of circle back, I think for that person that you're describing, so, maybe someone in the middle stages of dementia, really like a one-on-one or very small group visit is probably best. Like, that's probably not the person that you want to have come over to a crowd of 15. And that's really just to make things less stressful for the person and less stressful for the family. When we think about the middle stages of dementia, the risk for agitation and aggression increases. So, really, we want to look at avoiding an overstimulating environment so that we can mitigate some of those behaviors. And not to mention, for somebody with a more moderate dementia, engaging at all when they're in a crowded, overstimulating environment is going to be difficult, if not impossible. And especially if, like I mentioned before, on top of the cognitive impairment, there's something like a hearing impairment. So, for those folks, probably a small group or one-on-one visit will really allow you to focus on like meaningfully engaging your loved one versus them just like passively being there. And this might mean that in that situation, you go to the person to visit. So, for example, maybe mom lives in an assisted living facility or a memory care facility, so you go to her. Um, and that in that case, to circle back and answer your question a little more thoroughly, keeping in mind, one thing to keep in mind in this situation is how you're communicating with the person. So using some of the same communication strategies that you would use for any other visit, holiday or not. But as I said earlier, I think sometimes we get wrapped up, in the excitement and the chaos of the holidays, and it can be easy to forget, for example, those communication strategies. So things like speaking at a normal pace versus speaking super slowly, using short and concrete sentences. We talked about being face to face, and at eye level when you're talking. We talked about allowing the person to repeat themselves, things like that. So just for example, maybe dad always went to the church Christmas pageant. So you go to visit dad, and you would say, Sophie was in the Christmas pageant yesterday, and then just stop there for a moment versus, maybe everything that you really want to say, which is Sophie was in the Christmas pageant. She was an angel and she did so well. And some of the kids forgot their lines, but not our Sophie. In that second example, I've just said way too much for dad to process. And speaking of communication tips, the BCAT has a great resource for communication strategies, which is the Grade 8 Communications Tip Sheet you can find on our website. And then also, when you visit if you do go to visit your loved one with a more advanced dementia around the holidays, just trying to manage your own expectations. And I think this really applies. Lynn, you had mentioned, what if things have really declined in the past year? So maybe last year things were very different. But this year, mom has much more advanced impairment. So, just going in, realizing it may not be a realistic expectation that you'll be able to have a smooth conversation that would flow, just like if you were talking to her a year ago. And so you may need to do a little advanced planning for the visit so that you can really engage with that person. So, for example, maybe you bring along some simple items that will remind the person of the holiday or of your traditions together. As an example, maybe you celebrate Christmas and maybe you and mom always decorated the Christmas tree together. So you bring a small tabletop Christmas tree to put in mom's room, maybe along with a few meaningful ornaments. Or maybe you and mom always made latkes together for Hanukkah. So you bring some in to eat together. And also, music is a really great way to engage people. So, maybe playing a favorite holiday song and singing along with your loved one is a great idea.
Oh, I love that. That's a great idea.
Yeah. And if you're a little stuck on what to do, or even if you're not stuck, I think this is a great idea. I just want to point out another BCAT resource that might be helpful, and that is the Mempix book series. So for anyone who's not familiar, the Mempix books are really specifically geared toward meaningfully engaging people that have a more advanced cognitive impairment. They use a format of a picture followed by stories and simple questions. So, for example, there's a Mempix book on food, and one of the chapters is on apple pie. So maybe you use that picture to engage mom and to talk about the pie that she used to make make for every Thanksgiving, just as an example.
I love that. Coming equipped with an activity as opposed to expecting the whole day to just be conversational can really
Right.
help lower that stress level. And you have some when the conversation starts to run dry, you have something you can pull out of your bag. That's a great idea.
Exactly.
And we can share the links to those resources at the end of today's presentation. That's a great idea.
That would be great.
Jen, I know we're almost out of time. I have one last question I'd like to fit in if we can squeeze it in.
Sure.
Thinking about the loved ones and the caregivers and the folks that are planning these events and putting the time into hosting and inviting people over for the holidays, just having a holiday in general on a good day can be very stressful for people. Planning, organizing the food and the gifts and, everybody arriving on time and all the things. For the caregivers out there who are, during the holiday season, finding themselves highly stressed, is
Mhm.
there anything we can recommend to those folks who are the hosts of these events or who are planning to visit a loved one to kind of just lower their stress level and allow them to also enjoy the holiday season, as well as their loved one. They're working so hard to make it nice for their loved one. What can they do for themselves?
Yes, it's so true. And really, the primary thing that I would say is just trying to take care of yourself. And I know that sounds like a cliche, but it really is important. As you said, it can be stressful. It can be stressful to accommodate everyone's needs. I mean, maybe you have a teenager at home, and then you have a child coming home from college, and then you have an aging parent with dementia. It's a lot on top of just what you said, and already like the stress of the holidays already. But I think sometimes we neglect ourselves at the expense of trying to make the holidays great for everyone. So I totally understand it's easier said than done. But just trying to take at least some time for yourself. And some of our listeners, speaking of resources that we might want to put in the comments, some of our listeners may be aware of the 15 for Me program that we offer, which involves doing 15 minutes per day of like guided physical and or cognitive exercise, followed by centered breathing. I love 15 for Me. This program really can help to reduce stress. So while I'd recommend it for anyone, any time of year, it can be especially helpful around the holidays when stress levels are quite high. And then, a last tip would just be trying to build in rest breaks and downtime, really both for you and your loved one. And that
Yeah,
might
that's a
mean,
key ingredient, right? Because you get on that treadmill of shopping, wrapping, cooking,
Mhm.
cleaning, all the things, and it can be tough to take some time for yourself in between all the chaos. So, yeah, bring
Yes.
your best self to your own holiday event by
Exactly. And
preparing
that
ahead.
might Yes, it might mean saying no. I mean, to some things, like some gatherings, or not packing it all in one day. So just making sure, holidays are fatiguing for people with and without cognitive impairment. So just making sure that you and your loved one have adequate rest before and between events so that everybody can just really enjoy the holiday and be at their best.
Well, these are some really great tips. I mean, there's lots of good stuff here today, things you can implement immediately, things you can catalog for the next big family event that you have planned, whether you're traveling to your loved one or your loved one is traveling to you, just ways to maximize communication, anticipate needs and make those recommended changes to either simplify tasks, change the way you communicate, manage your environment. I think it's all a combination. If you can do a little bit of all of that, you will probably have a much more happy, relaxing, and stress-free holiday. And so will your loved one, which is a win for everybody.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. I think these are really great strategies people can implement, and we will share those links here at the end. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And that wraps up today's Family Matters interview. We hope to see you back in 2026 for our next topic. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.